Sorry. Hello and okay, I'm a little rusty. Into the synopsises, the summaries. It's not like OMG. So list of course, which is. Welcome to another video. My name is Heather, and as always, I'm reading with a vengeance. Contrary to my lack of content lately, first of all, Happy New Year. I hope everybody had a great Hollywood season. I hope everybody had a great holiday season. Mine was quiet. January is my absolute favorite month of the year, only because that means that December is over. I'm not a huge fan of the holidays. I like spending time with family, but the stress of it all, the consumerism of it all, I hate it. I hate December. I hope everybody had a really, really good December, and I hope your 2025 has started off really well. But I am here to record really everybody's favorite video of the year. I'm going to talk to you about what my favorite reads were for 2024. Couple of disclosures. This was a really interesting year. Compared to other years of reading. I read fewer books, I had more DNFs, yet I have a longer list of favorites for 2024 than I did in 2023. Very strange. I will tell you that I am about 20 books behind as far as books I haven't talked to you about that I read in 2024. 3 of those books are on this list, so I'm sorry I haven't talked to you about 3 of them, but I will. But I couldn't let another day go by before I did my top reads of the year. I read a total of 110 books. I put that number out there just for context, especially for a favorites video. The only books that are eligible to make my favorites of the year are full-length novels. Is it unfair to graphic novels and short stories and novellas? Perhaps. Although I do think maybe novellas might squeeze in there sometimes. But not this year. So the only books that are eligible for my favorites are full-length novels, and I read 84 of those this year. For a little bit more context, in 2022, I read like 160 some odd books, but that included graphic novels, and I read a ton of picture books that year. And I only had 10 DNFs all year. And then in 2023, I read, I want to say 115 books, and I DNF'd only 8. So I read fewer books, full-length novels this year. As I said, 84. I had 17 DNFs. That's a lot. I had a lot less patience for books that I wasn't enjoying. And I'm okay with that. I hope that trend stays because life is too short, and the way the earth is circling the drain anyways, I really want to just read stellar books. So this year, while I read fewer books, I have a top 12 with 3 honorable mentions. And as with previous favorite videos, they're not ranked. I just can't do it. I do have a top 5. That's the best I can do. Do you rank your children? Do you rank your pets? Come on. The only other disclosure I will say, other than nothing being ranked, is that not all of these books were published in 2024. Although quite a few of them were, and one of them hasn't even been published yet. Exciting list, I think. Lucy might be making an appearance. Maybe not. She's a little bit of a snob. All right, let's get into it. Starting with the honorable mentions. My first honorable mention is The Push by Ashley Audrain. It is a very dark exploration of motherhood. This is about a woman who, with her husband, both really want to start a family. They have a daughter, and the mom, Blythe, I believe is her name, does not connect with Violet, the daughter, like most moms do. She brings some of the incidents that happen between her and Violet to the attention of her husband, and her husband gaslights her. Then after a few years, Blythe has a son and things are so much better. She connects with her son, Sam, and then some bad things happen. This book explores the devastation that gaslighting can have on people. This explores generational trauma. This explores the complexities of being a mom, specifically when you have a woman who doesn't necessarily want to be a mom because of the generational trauma she's had with her mom and her mom's mom. The story makes you question, what would I do in this situation? It talks about the societal pressures that are put on women to become moms, of what you can and cannot say about being a mom and about your relationship with your children. The pacing is a little bit slower, but man, I could not look away from this book. Why it is an honorable mention and not necessarily in the top 12, I'm not sure. I can't really quite put my finger on it, but I absolutely had so many feelings about this book that it couldn't not be mentioned in this video. Next in the honorable mentions is I Was a Teenage Slasher by Stephen Graham Jones. This was my first by this author, and I loved it for so many reasons. I am still on the fence on this author's writing style, which is probably why it's an honorable mention instead of on the top favorites. But this book really was such a fun ride to read. Tolly, who is the main character, lives in a small town. He's 17 years old, trying to finish school. He's a good kid. He goes to this party one night and he's bullied by other kids, and he ends up getting cursed at this party. He spends basically the rest of the story exacting revenge on the people who have done him wrong. The things that I really loved about this story is Tolly himself reminded me so much of Demon Copperhead. I loved him so much. He had that twang. He had that wry sense of humor. He had that way of talking about hardships with humor. The other thing I loved about this book is it is an homage to 80s pop culture, specifically music and horror slasher films. It was so much fun, and being an 80s kid, of course, I'm going to love that about any story. It stays on the honorable mentions list because of the writing style. It took me a while to kind of immerse myself in the story. I wasn't quite sure what was going on, and maybe that's by design, but I got there and I ended up really loving this story. And finally on the honorable mentions list is Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward. This story follows a very poor Black family in a small Gulf coast town in Mississippi in the days leading up to Hurricane Katrina. The thing about Jesmyn Ward's writing, there's no hope, there's no light, there's no rays of sunshine. It's all tragedy and devastation. And I think that's why it's on honorable mention for me, is it just didn't leave me with a good feeling. However, her writing is so pristine, so beautiful, so lyrical. To use those adjectives on writing that is describing such horrible circumstances and incidents and events, I mean, that just takes raw talent. And that's why this was a favorite this year. It leaves you with all the feelings. None of those feelings will be feelings of joy, but she's definitely worth a read. All right, let's get into the meat and potatoes of this video, getting into the top 12 favorite books of 2024. First book I want to talk to you about is Beautiful Dreamers by Minrose Gwen. I found this by accident. It was an ARC on the shelf at work. Coming of age, 1950s, small town in the South. Again, another, I believe, Gulf Coast town in Mississippi. It follows a 13-year-old Memory and her mother, Virginia, who are going back to Virginia's hometown after a divorce. End up moving in with a close family friend. Everything is great until another person moves kind of in and develops a relationship with one of the characters, and then starts to develop a relationship with another one of the characters, and chaos and tension ensues, and it affects Memory in many different ways. And it's just a beautiful story. Memory has a very unique and unusual relationship with flora and fauna. But I thought it was really interesting on how it was woven into the story. It's a story about the relationship with mothers and daughters. I absolutely just loved this story. And it was very, very atmospheric as far as 1950s small Gulf Coast town. So yes, Beautiful Dreamers, Monroe's Gwen. It's not as popular as I hoped it would be. I hope you can get your hands on this book. It's absolutely worth it. Okay, anybody who knows me knows that if there are no books on my favorites of the year from the Women's Prize for Fiction, then, you know, who am I? I have two. You probably can guess what they were, because this past year, the Women's Prize left a lot to be desired, in my opinion. I had DNFs. I had books that I didn't really like. What's crazy is my two favorites from the list didn't even make the short list. Just criminal. Anyways, the first I'll talk to you about is In Defense of the Act by Effie Black. So unique. The act that is referred to in the title is suicide. And this story follows Jessica, who has a fascination with humans' tendency to end their own lives. And she talks about certain incidents of suicide that has touched her life. And she talks about the potential benefits of suicide. You heard me right. If you have questions about that, I just highly recommend reading this book. The story also deals with mental health. Well, obviously, it is Jessica coming to terms with her own queerness, looking at her own relationships in light of her fascination with suicide, and then this major event happens at the end. And if you think as you're reading it, you know what that event's going to be, or you know who it's going to involve, I promise you, you will be wrong. The end is an absolute gut punch, and I absolutely loved it. This is a debut novel, so I am highly anticipating what Effie Black is going to do next. The other book on the Women's Prize this year that made my favorite of the year is Ordinary Human Failings by Megan Nolan. This takes place in London in the 90s, and you're following an Irish family who have emigrated to London, and they're living on this estate, which is a word they use for the poor area. And they're a reclusive family, and one day a small child is found dead. All eyes and fingers are pointed at the reclusive Irish family, the outsiders, if you will. You're specifically following Carmel, I think is her name, the mother in the Irish family. If memory serves, what's happened in her life that has led her to be where she is now. You're also following the reporter who is covering this story. It is an exploration into class, poverty, generational trauma, the effects the media has on criminal investigations and society, and how people treat each other. This book was so stinking good. It's not a criminal procedural, even though a crime is at the crux of the story. I loved this book, and again, another one that didn't make the short list that just had me just rethinking the Women's Prize. Like, what happened this past year? That's another video. This book is literary fiction at its best. This is another one that I think will surprise all of you, but the next one on this list is Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. Most of you know that I am not typically a romance reader. There's way more going on in the story than just a romance. And even the romance that happens in this doesn't end up the way you think it should, and doesn't end up in the way most romances would end up. This follows Emma, and Emma thinks she's cursed. Every time she dates somebody and then breaks up with them, the very next person that the man she breaks up with meets ends up being the one for him. And so she thinks she's cursed. And then she meets Justin, like on a Reddit thread, because they're talking about this curse, and Justin thinks he has the very same curse. And so they decide, just as, you know, to break the curse, let's meet and date for a very short time, and then we'll break up, and then just by definition of the curse, we should meet the one after our breakup, right? So the story goes from there. Emma is a traveling nurse and she travels with her best friend who watches out for Emma. Emma has a tumultuous relationship with her mom. Justin is, I can't remember what he does for a living, but he is going to be caring for his 3 younger siblings because his mom has to go to prison for 6 or 7 years for reasons. So lots going on in this book, and it was just so well written, and the story didn't read like a romance. I'm not trying to throw shade at romance, but I guess I am. Romance just isn't my jam, baby, and this one just stood the test, and I absolutely loved it. So much depth. The characters are relatable and likable and humanly flawed and believable. I just really liked following the story of Emma and Justin, but of their stories of their lives independent of their relationship with each other, which is kind of anti-romance. I was really satisfied by the ending. Now, people who really love romance might not feel that way. Will I read more Abby Jimenez? Yeah, maybe. This one leaves really, really big shoes to fill. This list also would not be complete without one of my favorite authors of all time, and I'm talking about Stephen King, of course, and the book that made this list is Holly. Holly is the 3rd in kind of a series. It's the 3rd book that Holly, the character, appears in. And while those 3 books are chronological, you can read them independent of each other. Let's not get too wrapped around the axle with the details, but Holly as a character was first introduced in the Mr. Mercedes. Is it Mr. Mercedes or Mercedes Man? But anyways, that trilogy. She's beloved. I mean, I think because so many people loved her character so much, she got her own story. She's featured in the Mercedes trilogy as somebody who helps the main character, an investigator, as an investigator herself. And so in Holly, she has started her own private investigation company. She's initially hired by somebody to find their missing daughter, and it just leads to other missing people that seem to not be connected, but Holly finds a connection. And at the same time, you are learning more and more about Holly. She has some mental health issues. She has a toxic relationship with her own mom. Is this a theme? Mom, if you're watching this, don't read too much into this. We do not have a toxic relationship. Anyway, so it delves into that relationship that Holly has with her mom. And the story, the mystery, the villains in this book are so outside the norm of villains that you read about in horror novels or even mystery thrillers. Such a good story, so immersive, so suspenseful. Stephen King does thrills like just really, really well. And Holly was no exception. I absolutely love that Holly got her own story. Maybe she'll get another one. Uncle Stevie, if you're watching, I mean, because why wouldn't you? We're all waiting. One of the things that doesn't happen too often in my list of favorites is nonfiction being on the list. And I have 2 nonfiction books in my top 12. One of them is in my top 5, which of course we'll get to soon. But the first one is Democracy Awakening by Heather Cox Richardson. I talked a lot about this book, I think, in my last update, and in light, of course, the election results, and I'm not going to get too political here, but I was saddened and angered this year by the election results, and it was one of the kind of the first time, sadly, and shame on me, but where I was inspired to educate myself on how did we get here. This was one of the books that I wanted to read. So this one pretty much kind of lays out a history of our country and the author's attempt to come up with, maybe this is why we're here and this is how we got into this situation. And she highlights certain events in our history. I think that everything she talks about in her book is true historically. Does it have a certain interpretation that might be left-leaning? Perhaps, but still, it's history that I think is important that we learn about. I thought this was very well written. It was very accessible, and I thought it was a great start for me to educate myself so that I can have articulate, intelligent discussions with people on the other side of certain arguments. I highly, highly recommend it, regardless of what side of the fence you find yourself on. This one I thought was really easy to read. I read it in a very short period of time. I listened to it. It is narrated by the author, and I really enjoyed it. The next book on this list is All the Colors of the Dark by Chris Whitaker, and I am so happy to see how much this book is getting read and all the praise that this book is getting. This one takes place in a small town in Missouri in 1975, a time for really, really big change in our country. It's the end of the Vietnam War, sexual revolution, women's rights, lots of stuff going on in our country in the mid-70s. And you're following Patch, who is, I want to say he's around 11 when you first meet Patch. He's kind of a unique boy, and he befriends a neighbor girl, Saint. And then the daughter of the mayor is almost abducted by a serial killer that everybody knows is on the loose. And Patch is an unlikely hero, and things happen where Patch saves the girl, but he finds himself abducted. And he is in a dark room. He can't see anything, and there is another abductee in the room with him. And he develops a really, really close bond with this girl. And then somehow Patch escapes, the serial killer gets away, and this girl is gone, and nobody knows what has happened to her. And the story basically follows Patch and Patch's relationship with Saint as he grows up, and he is completely obsessed with finding out what happened to the girl that he was stuck in this room with. So it's coming of age. It's the friendship between Patch and Saint. It is a mystery thriller. So much going on, beautifully written. It spans 30 years. It started off shaky for me, but then I was in it, and I'm so glad I read it, and the ending is so satisfying and beautiful. Yeah, All the Colors of the Dark. All right, we're in our top 5, my top 5 favorite reads of 2024. Here we go. I'm going to start with the other nonfiction book, Ejaculate Responsibly. This one, well, this one's a short one. It's only 131, that's the acknowledgements. 126 pages. Does it meet my eligibility criteria? Maybe not, but who cares? Because I could not stop raving about this book. I'm really, really bummed about this subtitle because I think it's misleading. It says a whole new way to think about abortion, and that's not what this book is. So if you are completely uninterested in reading about the argument for or against abortion, that is not what's in here. What this book is an argument to put men in the accountability hot seat to frickin' keep it in their pants. It's the argument of why 100%, not 99.9, 100% of unwanted pregnancies are the man's responsibility. Controversial, right? Super controversial. You might be asking yourself, how do you figure? I mean, at least a little bit of the accountability is with the women, right? Read this book. She's got, is it 26 arguments? 28 arguments. Boop, 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 boop. Just listed one by one, and she gets into it. I think in light of what's going to happen, what is already happening with women's reproductive rights, this is super timely. I implore you to read it and give it to your sisters and your brothers and your sons and daughters and nieces and nephews and fathers and mothers. Anybody who has reproductive organs should read this book. It's freaking brilliant. The next book in my top 5 is Small Mercies by Dennis Lehane. OMG. I loved it so much. It was so good. It's so gritty. This takes place in 1974 South Boston. It's during a heat wave, and there's high tensions, racial tensions, because civil rights movement and just South Boston. And you're following Mary Pat, who is a white woman, and she lives with her teenage daughter, Jules. And they are close. But Mary Pat, she's a hard woman. She's a survivor. She's had some stuff happen in her life that have made her this way, but primarily it's because she was raised in South Boston. One night, Jules doesn't come home. During the same evening, a young black man is murdered, I believe at a subway station. And the two incidents appear unconnected, but Mary Pat kind of goes on an investigation of her own, asking questions around town and looking under rocks and really just being completely driven by her need to find her daughter. She ends up finding out that perhaps her daughter going missing and the murder of this young black man are connected. And she starts to ask the wrong questions to the wrong people, and she gets the attention of the local mob, and things go from there. And it is a fast-paced, suspenseful story. The thing that stands out about this story is Mary Pat isn't necessarily a likable character. She is racist as hell. But this book is a product of its time, and Dennis Lehane does an excellent job of staying authentic to the time and the place. I really, really hope they make this into a movie also. It's like, I feel like I want to Google the shit out of this book to see if it's even in talks, if maybe somebody has already bought the rights. I don't know. This would make a fantastic movie. Anyways, Mary Pat as a main character, you're not going to like her. However, I loved her fierceness as a mom, her determination, her fearlessness. Man, she's a tough broad. And the way Dennis Lehane made you root for a completely flawed human being. That takes talent. All of that aside, the story is just so engaging and suspenseful. Absolutely loved it. Going into our top 3 now, which will be ranked. So you're welcome. Number 3, Deadly Animals by Marie Tierney. I absolutely love this. This is a debut novel. It ticked so many boxes for me. Coming of age, British, mystery thriller. This one follows 14-year-old Ava, young British girl who has an unusual fascination with not death per se, but the effects death has on the body. And she starts by kind of collecting roadkill and looking at it as it changes over time. In that fascination, one day she discovers the body of somebody that she knows in town. She decides to try to help by placing an anonymous call to the police. And in doing so, she kind of puts herself in this investigation with the police. And the story goes from there. I loved the writing style. I loved the pace of this book. I loved Ava so much. I loved the police officer that she ends up talking to. I love the relationships that Ava has with other kids in the town. I feel like this could be the first in a series. So Marie, if you're watching, please, please, please bring Ava back. I would love to see her again. All right, number 2. This is the book that has not been published yet. I read the arc. The Savage Noble Death of Babs Dion. Look at this cover. This is by Ron Curry. This is a contemporary fiction. It takes place in a northern town of Maine, like right on the border of Canada. And you are following Babs Dion, who is a Franco-American. She kind of runs her small town. She's described as a vicious crime matriarch with the help of her lieutenants, who are 3 of her childhood friends, and also her daughters, one who is an army vet who served in Afghanistan and Iraq, and she comes back and she's got a drug problem of her own. And then Babs has another daughter who has some problems of her own. And so when the larger crime syndicate finds out that his numbers are down in Babs' area, he sends his people to pressure Babs into shutting down. Meanwhile, the youngest daughter goes missing and things happen. This is another gritty crime drama. I love Babs, totally flawed. Not the most likable person you'll ever meet. I love Lori, who is actually the Marine vet, not the Army vet. My apologies. She's got issues, but she is trying to overcome them. She has a certain ability that I am not going to spoil for you, but it's such a great part of the story. You know what I'm loving about the trend in most of the books in my favorites is the main character is a strong woman, ferocious and fearless, and stops at nothing for her family. So flawed in so many ways, but it doesn't detract their likability in other ways. And that's just the way people are. I blaze through this, you guys. So stinking good. The characters are so fascinating and so fun to read. The story is so suspenseful, and the ending I thought was highly satisfying. And it actually is kind of surprising to me that it was so satisfying, knowing what I know. So good, so stinking good. And I'm going to be reading more by this author for sure. All right, you guys, I actually have a #1 favorite of the year. Maybe you've guessed. I raved and raved and raved about this book. Perhaps it is absolutely no surprise to you that my favorite book of 2024 is The List of Suspicious Things by Jenny Godfrey. This was in my goodie bag when I went to the Women's Prize for Fiction live show in 2023, and it sat on my shelf for almost an entire year. And oh my goodness, I kicked myself for not reading it sooner. It's a debut. So The List of Suspicious Things follows Miv. She's 11 or 12 years old. She lives in Yorkshire, England, and she is living at home with her mom and her dad and her grandmother, I believe. Dad is working class. Her mom is dealing with some mental health issues. Miv's got her best friend, Sharon. And when Miv discovers what all the adults in town are talking about, the serial killer that is on the loose, Miv decides to take it upon herself with Sharon to try to find out who the Yorkshire Ripper is. And the Yorkshire Ripper is actually based on true events. There's a serial killer who ended up, I believe, murdering 13 women. So Miv decides to try to find out who it is because she believes that the Yorkshire Ripper is living in her town and that she possibly knows this person. So Miv and Sharon decide to come up with this list and write down suspicious things about the people in their neighborhood, people that they know, the shopkeeper, the librarian. In doing so, Miv discovers things about the people that she's been around all her life. And so while bad things are happening in her town because of the Yorkshire Ripper, good things are happening too. As that's happening, Miv and Sharon's friendship is tested when a third person comes into their friendship group and kind of creates a rift between Sharon and Miv. And that's a lovely, lovely story as well. So many boxes ticked for me on this book. Coming of age, British, from the point of view of a young girl, takes place in the late 70s. This book made me laugh. It made me cry. It made my heart warm. I loved the characters. I loved Miv so much. It's such a beautiful book. It's almost 500 pages, but it doesn't feel like it. I blazed through this book. It's so well written. It's such a great story. The characters are so beautiful and wonderful and likable and relatable. And it'll remind you of your childhood friendships that you had. And this book will break your heart, but it puts the pieces back together again. Absolutely love this book. #1 book of 2024, The List of Suspicious Things by Jenny Godfrey. So good. So that is it. Those are my favorite books of 2024. I hope you enjoyed it. What have been some favorites for you this past year? I would love to hear about them. Please feel free to put them down in the doodly-doo. I'm always open to recommendations, or you can just say hi as usual. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.